Okay, so the recording is underway, everybody. So I'm delighted today to be able to introduce Professor Lucy Middlemiss, who is a researcher at the Sustainability Research Institute at Leeds University. And over to you, Lucy, to introduce your topic for today.
Thank you very much. Just get my screen shared. Can you see that all right?
Yeah,
brilliant. Just maybe to say that what I'm talking about today is a project that was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and I'm representing a really big team, all the names on the screen there. I was hoping to have Emily with me, but she's not well. So the main focus I will have today is on the way we've sort of talked about conceptualizing socially inclusive environmental policy in the face of net zero, thinking about what a just transition to net zero means and how you might actually get that just really into net zero. Just a couple of other things I'd like to say before I start is that I am involved in other research as well. So I'm currently on a big EU project about energy poverty, which is we're following the renovation of a tower block in Leeds, 3 tower blocks actually in Leeds, and talking to the people within that block about their experiences of that. And then the third one is about retrofit. So it's about able to pay households and how they seem to approach retrofit, and that's getting a lot of traction at the moment. So if anybody has a particular interest in that, I can also share some writing and findings from that in the chat or later by email. Please do get in touch if you do. So the Nuffield project that is about understanding how we might do a socially inclusive transition to net zero. The climate, really this is about thinking about the climate crisis and thinking about inequality and the sort of the need to engage with a whole range of different people in the net zero process. And we've done a number of different things as part of this project. I'll move on just to tell you what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll be summarising insights from this project that we've done, which is about who's vulnerable in this transition and what we can do about it. The key focus here is about how life will change to net zero, how that's shaped by current inequalities, and then also as a result, how we can think about how we address net zero more inclusively. And one of the ways we've done this is by producing this framework, which is a sort of diagnostic tool, or maybe more a sort of a series of critical questions in a way to ask in order to try and think through the justice impacts of policy. And I'm going to introduce this way of thinking today. I was hoping to be able to hand over to Emily to talk about how we've applied that framework, and I don't know enough about the work that she's been doing to do that, so we'll have to leave that to another day, I'm afraid. Maybe she'll be able to come back at a different time. Just to give you a bit of an outline of the project, we started by recognising that some socioeconomic and demographic groups will be disproportionately burdened in the transition to net zero, specifically that families on low incomes, in poor housing, with poor access to services are at risk in the net zero transition. These families are spatially patterned, and as such, the impact of the transition will vary regionally, with a particular concern for Yorkshire, the north of England. And in recognising this, we sort of come to our key research question, which was what will these changes mean to people's everyday lives, and how can they be supported through these changes? And then very briefly, we took 4 key steps to do the work. Firstly, we did a very extensive review of the literature to understand what's already known about this issue. Second, we developed this framework to conceptualise participation in net zero, which I'll present today. And then we've tested the framework in participatory workshops with households in Leeds and also in Newcastle to develop a revised version. And really what you're seeing today is the kind of revised version from that. And then at the moment, Emily is fairly active working with stakeholders to try and kind of road test this in practice. And that's something I can't talk about much today. just before I get started, I also wanted to point out that we're taking a person-centered approach, and that's a kind of very jargony term that I think people are using a lot at the moment. What we mean by it is that we're articulating at net zero and understanding net zero from the point of view of the household. So we want to understand we're sort of trying to think about what is it going to be like to live through this as a household. And the first part of our work has been about characterising the various areas of life in which people face changes. So on the left-hand side here on my slide, you can see where we live, where we go, what we eat, what we do for fun, what we spend our money on, where we work. They're deliberately sort of accessibly framed summaries of the areas of life that will be shaped by net zero in some way. So the first thing I would say about the person-centered approach here is that when you start seeing it in those terms, you realise that we're expecting, really transformative social change here across pretty much most aspects of everyday life for us as ordinary people. And that transformative social programme means it will very likely affect different kinds of people really differently, depending what kind of job you have now, what kind of things you eat now, where you live now. All these things are going to be shaping the way that people will be able to respond to it. So we're interested in how these areas work independently, but also how they work in conjunction with each other in everyday life. So, for example, where someone works is always linked to where they live and where they go. So how they travel around. This means that dealing with these things separately is kind of unrealistic. And it's also worth noting that changes across these areas of life will affect people differently according to where they live, given the various differences we know about within and between regions. So some examples here: the north-south divide in the UK, peripherality and centrality, whether you live in the city centre or on the outskirts, or in Hull or in Leeds, for instance. And then the rural-urban divide is another really big one in terms of thinking about what sort of amenities you have access to, and therefore how this transition is going to hit you effectively. We use the word participation to sort of link all these ideas together, asking one of our critical questions is, how do we enable everyone to participate in the net zero transition? These terms of person-centered, place-based participation, or sometimes, the sort of social difference and the spatial differences, I'll be kind of referring to throughout the talk. So without further ado, I'm getting to my big idea. I like to get there quite early so that you get a chance to kind of absorb it. And I'm going to kind of explain the big idea as I go through the slides afterwards. And really the big idea is quite simple. In a sense, we've pulled together these sort of a relatively simple list of critical questions to help us conceptualize more inclusive policy. So we look at, firstly, are people able to participate now? And by participate, we mean participate broadly in society. We have formal definitions for this, but for the purposes of today, are people able to live a good life effectively in the society we live in? And how are inequalities in the society we live in affecting people's ability to live good lives? Starting from here is really important, because if we don't start from here, then we're immediately alienating anyone who doesn't live a life that is kind of comfortable in some way, because most people, there's a lot of people don't think they can participate fully in society at the moment. And so, that's an important starting point to bear in mind. Second question, how will lives change in a net zero? And I've listed those different areas of life, like where do we live, what do we eat, etc. We can see this really huge programme of change coming, and I'm not sure it ever really is quite articulated in those terms, in those sort of person-centred terms, which is something we think is really important, because actually, there are a lot of things happening, and people will be starting to join up the dots between their employment, their travel practices, and so on. And we need to be having those conversations about the whole, so that people can see that big change coming. The third question, what risks of exclusion does this present? All policy risks damaging some people's interests. We need to know how net zero does that, in order, as well as understanding who is at risk of exclusion, in order to think about how we can make better policy for net zero, which includes rather than excludes. So there we have the fourth question, who's at risk of exclusion, and the fifth, what are the opportunities for inclusive net zero policy? So we think this framework is useful for thinking through policies on net zero, and we are looking at the sort of more complex version of the framework. We're looking at turning steps into indicators and thinking about finding ways of addressing these through policy. And but for now, I'm going to go through each of those questions in turn in order to just sort of take you through a slightly richer picture of it. So are people able to participate now? So as I've said, it's really critical to know what people's current position is, how existing inequalities are affecting people's ability to fully participate in society across these areas of life affected by net zero. So I've listed some of the key inequalities that we've identified in the areas of life that are relevant to the net zero agenda. Again, we see the wide reach of this agenda, which touches on eating, fun, work, travel, etc. But we also know that these inequalities are spatially patterned. So, for instance, where we live, we know that housing stock is variable across regions and by tenure type. We know that where we live affects what we do for fun. So whether there's affordable and available leisure in the local area. So for instance, if you live in a rural area, the likelihood is you haven't got much diversity of leisure in your local area. So your opportunities for going out and having fun, engaging in leisure are reduced. If we're all travelling less, which is kind of the prescription under net zero, then that becomes much more challenging for rural residents than it does for those living in urban areas. And then, for example, under where we live, the fact that housing stock is variable across regions by tenure type. If you live in private rented or social rented even, your ability to make changes in your home is restricted, and so as a result, you may be living in a not particularly nice place in the first now. Never mind thinking about what happens as temperatures go up and as we try and move towards more efficient housing. So the main concerns here are really about exclusion due to where you live, and where you live becomes, you can see that it's kind of written through this in lots of ways. So, whether in terms of what you do for work, is there employment available? In terms of what we do for fun, we've talked about, but also where we go, what kind of public transport is accessible in where you are. But it's also about what you earn, and by extension, what resources you have access to. And those two things are also shaped by where you live. So this is a kind of very sort of intersectional situation in a way, in the sense that all these different things can kind of have a knock-on effect on other aspects. So we know that some people are, the short answer to are people able to participate now is some people can, some people can't. And so knowing who can't is really important from the point of view of what we do next in terms of how we design policy. Our second question is, how will life change in the net zero? And I think I've already started to answer that in detailing the different areas of life that we've identified. But we can map the present impacts of those areas of life from a carbon perspective. And this work is done by my colleague Anne Owen, who does the UK carbon footprint. But she's divided the UK carbon footprint into different life domains as we've identified them. So the print is really small here. But the blue is where we live, the yellow is where we go, green is what we eat, red is what we do for fun, and purple is spending power, or what we consume, sort of thing. We've also done that across income deciles in the UK, and those of you that work in this area, which is probably most of you, will know that correlation is just like it holds across countries, it holds across regions. It's always the case that the lowest income households have the least carbon footprint, and the highest income households have the highest carbon footprint on average. This is across the whole of the UK. Having said that, we need to take that forward into thinking about net zero. So to recognise this uneven distribution at present. So for instance, you can't go around telling people to reduce the number of flights they take when they don't take any, which is very much the case in the bottom deciles. That those bottom deciles are unlikely to be flying you know, at all, if and definitely not often. It's also notable that where we live and where we go, so that's the blue and the yellow bands, make up a really large part of all footprints. And so they become really important in terms of thinking about how we address this problem. Where the blue band is very interesting where we live, because it's pretty consistent across the deciles, which means that, you know, if you increase costs associated with where we live, as we've seen in the winter for the energy crisis, you really hit the poorest households the hardest, because I mean, in a sense, it's showing that our carbon footprint in that area is less flexible and more difficult to reduce, because those lowest income households would have reduced it if they'd had the opportunity to, most likely. And then just to also point out, the red band is what we do for fun. Now that includes flights for holidays, and so that's really the main thing that explains that growth across the deciles. But then you can see that the impact of the 10th decile, which is the second to last bar in the graph from the right hand side, is so much higher than the first decile, which is the first one on the left hand side. So the implication of all of this is that lots of aspects of life will change, but also that it will look really different for different people, and that people join this journey in a way in a very different place according to where they, you know, where in that scale they sit, but all sorts of other reasons as well. Now, before I go on to deal with the other 3 questions I have, I just wanted to briefly break off to tell you a short story so that I can explain the last 3 questions of the framework in the light of Jane. So in our empirical work, we took this detailed picture of the future under net zero to participants from low-income areas of Leeds and Newcastle, and we asked them what they thought about these plans, effectively. So Jane is responding here to the idea of giving up a car, and I think it's a really nice example of the kind of reaction that people had, and I'm going to unpack it a bit in this slide and beyond. So she says, when you come from a deprived estate and you're living on the breadline, obviously I feel my resistance to give up our car. If I did give up the car, it would significantly have a massive impact on our children's, basically what we can do for them. So, you know, things like being able to participate in sports club, being able to participate in after school clubs, the fact that these things aren't on your doorstep and you do need to be able to toddle about to give them life skills and opportunities. If you don't, then looking out in these deprived areas and seeing that there's nothing there on their doorstep. So Jane was from a low-income family, a couple with 2 school-aged children in a really poorly resourced neighbourhood. And this concern is typical in the sense that for her, travel is about giving her kids a good start in life in a poorly connected, poorly resourced neighbourhood. So there's this sort of strong emphasis on the fact that there aren't opportunities locally. And so, you know, if she wants to create a future for them, she has to move. She has to move out of her area. And this came out really strongly as one of the a sort of key challenge in the transition to net zero for these households that we've been talking to. So coming back to my critical questions again. The third question was about the risks of exclusion this presents. And what I'm going to do is use this idea of mobility and moving around as a bit of a kind of way of focusing the next 3 slides, just to, because it's easier to talk about this through one example rather than the whole picture. But the specific additional risks that people face in net zero with regard to mobility, taking the lead from Jane's story, well, we can see that there are aspects of Jane's story that are about just needing to participate socially, and that's listed on the slide as part 3. So there are challenges of getting around to family and friends and for leisure, and if mobility decreases, that's a real concern for people. So that's a sort of one key component of the way that people think about this, is that if provision where you live isn't that good, you're likely to be excluded from different kinds of participation. So that would include social participation, which is the third point here, and then also the second and fourth. So political and civic participation depends on how things are provided for in your area. If there's no opportunity to use public transport because the public transport isn't good enough, then perhaps you're not able to be that good net zero citizen that you would like to be. Also, if there's employment, education and skill opportunities in the area, and the siting of these things is really, really critical in terms of whether people can access them through low carbon means, or if at all, in fact. The more obvious point is the first one on my slide. Sorry, I've dealt with this slide in a very haphazard manner, but the more obvious one is the first one. Can you afford to keep up effectively? And so there's a real concern about shift to electric vehicles, people being stuck with old technology and having to pay more as a result, or the risks associated with whether your area happens to be one in which the public transport system is improving at speed or not. So when we think about those sorts of risks of exclusion, we can start to think about who in particular is at risk. And if we stick with the mobility example, we can see that those in the future at risk of further exclusion in the future are likely to be similar to those already at risk in the present, which would be people with limited mobility, disabled people, for instance, people living in poorly connected neighbourhoods, people without the economic capital to invest in new technology, those whose loved ones live far away, so in-country and international migrants, and people who don't feel safe with active travel or public transport options, so from the LGBT plus community, women, migrants, etc. And then the fact that the people with these characteristics are sometimes patterned by place, not always, obviously, because some of those disabled people are spread fairly evenly through the population, as are women, people from LGBT plus community, and so on. But those with particularly those in poorly connected neighbourhoods, that's really important, because effectively you might be subject to infrastructural exclusion in places that are rural, low income, peripheral, and there are exclusions that exist already. And so if we're going to deal with this well, we need to be thinking about sorting this out fairly sharpish in order for people like that to feel like they can actually see a future in net zero at all. Just to say that if we'd taken a different example, we would have ended up with a slightly, like thinking about where people live, we might have ended up with a slightly different list of people that are at risk. So the risks are not the same for everyone across the whole agenda, which makes things quite complex as well. So what are the opportunities for inclusive policy? What can we do about this? We can see that in the mobility example, for instance, there's some policy options that clearly have better impact for those at risks. So the first two bullets here, investing in cheap, accessible, safe, green public transport is a kind of magic policy for social inclusion, because it kind of lowers the bar for participation in mobility, so for people being able to get places. It helps address both inequality and climate change. This and the promotion and support of active travel, the second bullet here, are both redistributive and address climate change as well. Whereas the transition to electric vehicles is not so positive, because there's still a huge upfront cost for that. And those are in the more at-risk demographics, particularly low-income households, will struggle to participate in that. So the third bullet there is kind of interesting, because it's not really the usual focus of this kind of policy area. We don't normally think about the sort of effectively the planning of communities in terms of what opportunities are available to people there. But we can see that when we think about Jane, she really needed better leisure and cultural activities within her communities for her kids in order to feel like she was giving them a decent childhood. I mean, while this is not the usual focus of net zero policy, I feel like there's a really critical role then, because of the fact that this is a really transformative social vision that's being proposed under net zero, for government to be working across departments and dealing with that kind of thing as part of this transition, as part of a vision of a different kind of future. So there is hope, I think, in the sense that the net zero agenda does offer opportunities for progressive change. However, an inclusive just transition does require proactive, progressive, well-designed, forward-thinking, cross-departmental policy, which is really challenging, I think. And I think it's also really important to note that the problem looks very different in different places. And as a result, we think that place-based and people-centred policy is really essential, which implies integrating social inclusion and net zero across a range of government departments in terms of those two core kind of social goals for the next 10 to 20 years. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that I get to have some interesting conversations with you in the next half hour.
Lucy, thank you very much. It was absolutely fascinating. I will just stop the recording if I can. So I'm going to, here we are.